Quintorius was a student at the Lorehold College at Strixhaven. He was always more interested in studying the history of war, rather than engaging in combat himself. However, during the Phyrexian invasion, he had little choice, as he and a collective of his classmates banded together to find and recreate the invocation of the Founders. During the ritual, something went wrong, and Quint's planeswalker spark ignited, whisking him away to planes beyond his wildest imagination. After the invasion, Quint went on a journey to explore the multiverse to study the planes for his former college. Perhaps along his travels, he visited the plane of Ravnica. What a better place to study military history than the Boros Legion? While observing a training routine, one thing in particular piques Quint's interest: the Sunforger technique the soldiers use. It provides a lot of potential because the hammer channels the power of the Legion's best spells when thrown, but it tends to leave a lot of waste lying around as the hammer breaks down during use. This starts the gears turning in Quint's mind. What if I could recover the magic being channeled by the Sunforger? He asks himself. Well, if I could do that, then I essentially could cast the spell twice, but only with half the components. And a Sunforger would let me quickly grab the exact spell I needed for a given situation. So altogether, this would give me the time in battle to amass the resources I needed to cast those super powerful spells that I've learned about. And with this, Quint sets out to acquire a Sunforger, so he can dominate the battlefield. Let's quickly review Sunforger. Sunforger is a 3-drop equipment that can give +4/+0 to a creature after you pay 3 to equip it. And more importantly, when it's attached to a creature, you can pay a red and a white to detach it and search your library for any red or white instant with mana value 4 or less and cast it for free. Sunforger is a very cool and different effect than what you'd expect to see in the Boros colors. And that's exactly what I thought when I stumbled upon it while building a Firesong and Sunspeaker deck back in 2019. This was part of me trying to figure out how to make Boros work in the Commander. And I had settled on trying to use cards like Earthquake to gain a bunch of life, which would give me even more time to find an actual win con, which was usually just casting an even larger Earthquake after I generated a whole bunch of mana. And not really thinking about card synergies, I had thrown in the Sunforger card I thought was cool. All I really ended up using it for was just to cast the Swords to Plowshares or Boros Charm sometimes, but it always felt pretty impactful when it was in play. This planted the seed of trying to build a deck solely based on Sunforger, and not just having it as a synergy piece that happened to be in the deck. Even though Sunforger is an incredibly powerful card, it still has some major issues that make it hard to work with in a format like Commander. The largest problems that I ran into were that I had no way of guaranteeing I ever saw it in my hand. If I ever did happen to draw it, it was usually kill on sight because of the fact that it could do pretty much anything, which is only exacerbated by the fact that you could only equip it at sorcery speed, which made it easy for my opponents to stop it before it got online because you could blow it up with any sort of shatter effect. The mana investments required to get everything set up are a lot. You need 8 mana just to cast it, equip it, and unattach it for the first spell. And then every time you want to use it after that, you have to spend another 5 mana to first equip with the Sunforger and then unattach it to cast another spell. And to top it all off, unless your deck is mostly instants and sorceries, you're gonna run out of good targets for Sunforger to hit. I couldn't figure out how to solve these problems, so I decided just to table the idea and come back to it at a later date. Fast forward to the end of 2023, and I had a deck built around General Ferrous Rockheart. I thought to myself, I should include a Sunforger. It's a huge flavor win. But I essentially ended up repeating the same process that I had done years ago. Sunforger just ended up not fitting in this deck, because it was a deck all about casting cheap, low mana, multicolored spells to make golems and then go beat people's faces in. It didn't really have the space to spend 8 mana to cast a single Swords to Plowshares. So I was about to give up on this card altogether, but I decided to give it one more shot, and I was going to try to fully just build a deck around Sunforger first, and then put synergies around it to make it work. So I started looking at potential new commander options that had come out that EDH Rick said were common Sunforger commanders, but I didn't end up liking any of them, and I'll give a quick run through as to why I think that is. Feather let you cheat the equip cost by being able to tutor things like a Magnetic Theft to be able to reattach Sunforger to one of your creatures, and it even could recycle the cards that you tutor for as long as they target one of your own creatures. But in order to be able to keep cards constantly moving with Sunforger, it required that you limit the number of things that you could tutor for in the deck, and I really just wanted to use this as a general toolbox sort of approach, and then find cards that would work around. Kellen could guarantee that you get Sunforger in hand, but aside from that, he really just only offered being a nice body to equip it to, so he's actually probably a better fit in the 99 of a Sunforger focused deck instead. Sir Gwyn was probably the option I liked the most. She offered you the ability to negate the equip costs, and could provide card draw, and also expand your card pool to include anything with black in it. But her playstyle tended to lend to a more aggressive game plan, where you make a bunch of cheap knights, and then throw cheap equipment on them to be able to ride to victory. And I was really trying to focus on using Sunforger first, not the other way around. Arden was another good option. He allowed you to essentially cheat the equip cost once per turn, and with the different partners available, he could even expand the colors of spells you could play with by adding either blue, black, or green to the pool. But I really didn't like how the partner usually wasn't super relevant to the deck, they just kinda sat there. But then I saw Quintorius, and I realized he solved some of the major problems that I was having with Sunforger. So let's cover Quintorius. For 3 generic, a red and a white, you get a 3/5 of Vigilance, and at the beginning of your end step, you exile a non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard, and make a 3/2 spirit. Then if you tap him, sacrifice a spirit, pay 1 generic, a red and a white, you can cast one of the cards that he's exiled for free until the end of turn. If that spell will go to your graveyard, it goes to the bottom of your library instead. This does still follow timing restrictions, so you don't get to cast sorceries on other people's turns. Now what I like about him is that he cares about all non-creature spells in your graveyard, so he offers us more to do than just simply looking at Sunforger's stuff. He also makes spirits, which can be good chump blockers, or let us win the game by swinging for a whole bunch of damage. And if the spell that you're exiling with him has a mana value of greater than 3, he's saving you mana when he happens to recast them. Finally, he can also recycle instants and sorceries to the bottom of your library so you can recast them with Sunforger. Because he gets back the things that you tutored with Sunforger, and he can also put those cards back on the bottom of your library, he also creates some very interesting value loops we'll see later. But first off, let's look at some very powerful game-ending loops that Quintorius is able to pull off thanks to Sunforger. This first combo clears an item off of my magical bucket list of finding a way to win with Thieves' Auction. The setup is as follows. First, you gotta exile Thieves' Auction with Quintorius. Then on a later turn, use Sunforger to tutor out Teferi's Protection. With Teferi's Protection on the stack, activate Quintorius, so that way you're allowed to cast Thieves' Auction until end of turn, and then once the Teferi's Protection resolves, cast Thieves' Auction for free. And then finally, you get to draft the best of everyone's permanents. It's pretty hilarious, but if your playgroup gets upset with this, well, you can always swap out Thieves' Auction for a copy of Worldfire. But you know, mass land destruction. This combo can win you the game on the spot, but I took it out personally because I think it's a little over-centralizing, but if you want to be real nasty, this is something you can do as well. First, use Sunforger to tutor Chance for Glory. Then on your end step, Quintorius will exile Chance for Glory. During your extra turn, activate Sunforger and tutor for Angel's Grace, that way you don't lose. Activate Quintorius, casting Chance for Glory from exile, and then put that on the bottom of your library as it resolves. Then on your end step, Quint will exile Angel's Grace, and then repeat this process for infinite turns. Another funny combo involves Delayed Blast Fireball. First off, use Sunforger to tutor Delayed Blast Fireball. It will deal 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. On your end step, Quint will exile Delayed Blast Fireball. You can then activate Quintorius, cast Delayed Blast Fireball from exile, dealing another 5 damage instead of 2 damage. Delayed Blast Fireball then goes on the bottom of your library, ready to go again. If you had the mana for Sunforger, you could activate it a 3rd time if you really wanted to. Now that you see some of the potential for what Quint and Sunforger can do, let's break down how the deck actually operates. We have 3 main stages for this deck. First, we're going to build our own value engine so we can get cool things to cheat out. Then we're going to use Sunforger to clear any potential roadblocks and or answers for our threats our opponents have played. And then finally, we unleash our own giant spells upon our enemies to crush them. For our initial value generation, we're going to be playing into red and white's best strengths in Commander, discarding things and reanimating them back to play. This will be a high-level summary of the idea, but if you'd like to learn more, I'd recommend reading Kirsten Gregory's article about the Boris Advantage engine. She goes into more detail about the concept and how to use it in a more creature-focused mid-range style of deck, whereas this deck's more of a spell-slinging control style of deck, so the lessons aren't quite the same. For the basics of how we generate value, first we gotta look at cheap card draw effects in our colors. In red and white, card draw is difficult, and then the white options typically require that we either give our opponents cards, or set a trap and wait for them to give us cards. Now these are not bad by any means, but I think we could do better in a way that supports our game plan of being able to pull stuff out of the graveyard. Red has a lot of different effects that are essentially 2 mana to discard a card and draw 2 cards, and this will let us exchange the worst card in our hand right now for 2 potentially better cards. And if we use this with the tools that white has to reanimate things, we could essentially use this to keep up with other decks in terms of raw card intake. For example, let's say I control a Sun Titan, and in my hands I have 2 planes and a Thrill of Possibilities. If I discard the planes with Thrill of Possibility and draw 2 cards, I can then attack with Sunforger and bring back that planes I just discarded. So for 2 mana, I get to trade that 1 planes in my hand for 2 new cards, and still make my land drop for the turn. It's not terrible, but let's take a look at another example. Now let's say it wasn't a planes that I wanted to discard, but instead I had something like Cauldron Complete. Sun Titan couldn't get that out of the graveyard, but if I had something else like a Daretti, Campus Renovations, or a Forge Anew, I could then pull that card out of the graveyard. Now for 5 mana, I get to swap what's in my hand, get a 5/5 Cauldron Complete, and also if I had used like Forge Anew to bring that back, I could even slap that Cauldron Complete onto Sun Titan to make it an even more formidable force swinging at my opponents. And that's the basics of our early game plan. For our mid-game plan, we're going to talk about our Sunforger package. If you aren't familiar with what a Sunforger package is or how to build one, I would recommend watching Tolarian Community College's video on the topic. I'll provide a very quick summary of it, but I don't want to essentially just recreate the professor's video here. The first element of a Sunforger package is how to get Sunforger in your hand in the first place. We have 9 cards that can tutor for Sunforger, and their flexibility offers us the ability to also find other key cards, like our win conditions, in the later turns. Stoneforge Mystic and Goblin Engineer allow us to tutor for Sunforger, and can also cheat it into play without casting, which is great for getting around counter magic. Fighter class can help reduce the equip cost if we really need it, and we can use the 3rd level to make our creatures also act as removal. Gamble and Reckless Handling can also give us the ability to tutor for something else and discard it with the ability to cheat it back into play with Quint or with other reanimation effects. The next step is we need to find ways to cheat the equip costs. For easy ways to avoid the equip cost, you've got guys like Brasquire and Fervent Champion that just reduce the costs or completely avoid them. Cards like Forge Anew and Pure Steel Paladin can make them 0. Zerda can make your equip costs go down by 2, but they can also reduce the other abilities in the deck by 2, which is pretty powerful. And then there's Sigarda's Aid, which lets you cast Sunforger as an instant, and also cheat the equip costs altogether by just slapping it onto a creature for free when it enters. And then finally, the most important part of an actual Sunforger deck is the cards that you can cast with Sunforger. Altogether, I have about 25 cards in my Sunforger package, and rather than go through each individual group that can be there, which can be kind of fuzzy when you have cards like Reverberate that fit in multiple categories, I want to go over some highlights about what cool interactions some of them have. The way I've structured my Sunforger package is to have the majority of my cards be some sort of removal or combat trick, and very few of the cards are just generic utility cards. Due to this, I use Sunforger as an absolute last resort to remove the largest threat at the current moment. Now you can offer to use Sunforger as a political tool to remove something for your opponents, but since you are aiming to ultimately control the board, the thing keeping an opponent in check might be better left on the board if we can afford to do so. First cool card to highlight, Glorious End. Got a player that's storming off, somebody casts an Apex Devastator, well guess what, Glorious End just takes care of all that garbage. You just gotta make sure you have something to do about the lose the game trigger. Another cool card, Deflecting Palm. Someone swing a 10,000 power creature at you, well now it's their problem, not yours anymore. That a loyalty is a weird combat trick that no one really expects. See a cool creature about to eat a removal spell? Well, it can be yours now. Aloran Searing Light is another cool card. It exiles 3 of the biggest guys on the board, it doesn't target, and the fact that I've used it before to kill my opponents for going way too tall is just kind of a bit of a bonus. And then Pull from Eternity helps fix problems where someone removes Quintorius before we get a chance to cast a spell that's exiled with him, since replaying Quintorius won't give us access to the cards his previous version had exiled. It also helps get our win cons back should someone try to think that exiling them is enough to stop us. One of my favorite value loops in this deck is to use Sunforger with something like Cosmic Intervention to either draw a ton of cards or ramp a bunch of lands into play. You start off by using Sunforger to tutor Cosmic Intervention. When it resolves, you get a replacement effect until end of turn where if your permanents are put into the graveyard from play, instead they go to exile and they come back at the end step. Then, you go and you sacrifice a bunch of permanents, things like Fetch Lands, Mind Stone, Roadside Reliquary, or a Bitter Reunion. You can also sacrifice an artifact to something like a Demand Answers or a Goblin Engineer. Then on your end step, those cards will return, but you hold priority and sack them all again. Since it's still your turn, that replacement effect is still there, and they'll all get exiled to come back in the next player's end step. I've used this before to ramp about 6 lands in one single turn cycle, just simply by having 2 lands and then the Cosmic Intervention. Now that we've used Sunforger to answer what our opponents are doing, it's time for us to play our own win con. Our end goal here is to deploy a giant spell that's going to win us the game, and then use Sunforger to have the interaction to be able to protect it. I don't have an extra reading assignment for this section, but here's a fun interaction. Esper Sentinel is essentially a white Mystic Remora when you equip it with a Sunforger, due to the fact that its triggered ability is tied to its power. I've only packed about 4 large spells into the deck for us to help close things out, but with the amount of tutoring and recursion that we have access to, we shouldn't have an issue with trying to find them and keep them in play. The first one we want to look at is Parhelion 2. This Pioneer All-Star is a vehicle that creates an army of angels when it attacks, and it effectively swings for 13 damage, not to mention that it can also play defense due to the vigilance part. It also crews itself after attacking once, which is also good in case a Quintorius gets removed. The recently printed Valor's flagship offers a similarly large flying beater, and while it doesn't come with an army of angels, it offers lifelink in exchange, and if the game goes along and you have a lot of mana lying around, you can use that mana to cycle it and make an army of 1/1 pilots. Culture Complete is a fantastic indestructible equipment that gives +5/+5 first strike trample, indestructible haste, and to top it all off, anything that it deals combat damage to gets exiled, but that 7 mana equip cost is a little bit hefty. Thankfully, it has Living Weapon, which means it automatically makes a 0/0 germ and gets attached to the germ. So once it's in play, you're going to be getting more damage thrown on the ground, since no one wants to just get their creature exiled for blocking. Attached is the Quint, and you've got a mighty source of commander damage and a great blocker on the crackback due to Quint having vigilance. It's also a great idea to attach Sunforger to whatever Cauldron is attached to, since the creature's indestructible, and making a 9/5 Trampler sounds like an even better idea. And our last big splashy spell is Rise of the Eldrazi. This 12 mana sorcery can't be countered, destroys a permanent, draws you 4 cards, and gives you an extra turn. It does exile itself afterwards, but you can use Pull from Eternity or Reverberate to get multiple instances of the spell going. After we've locked down the board, we want to have a way to get our win con out pretty quickly. And each of our win cons has different ways to be tutored. For Cauldron Complete, we can find it with Stoneforger, Fighter Class, Forging the Tyrite Sword, and Kellen. Goblin Engineer, Reckless Handling, and Enlightened Tutor can find Cauldra, but they can also find Valor's Flagship and Parhelion too. And you can always use Gamble to find anything that you need, as long as you're willing to gamble that you won't get it discarded afterwards. But with the amount of recursion that we have, some might call that a benefit. With all that main deck stuff out of the way, let's talk about the mana base. The mana base for this deck runs about 36 lands in total, but really if you count the modal double face cards, it has 41. And those lands are broken out as follows. We've got 12 basics, 7 fetch lands, 8 utility lands, and 12 dual lands. For the fetch lands, I happen to have gotten a bunch of off-color, non-budget fetches and trades recently, so I figured I'd run some. Prior to that, I only had an Arid Mesa and Prismatic Vista and a Fabled Passage. It's a little overkill to run all the off-color fetches, and it's not where I would prioritize putting money first into a deck like this. However, it does make the turns where you run Cosmic Intervention to ramp a lot more feasible, so let's cover some budget-friendly alternatives so you can do the same thing. These 7 fetch lands can all be used instead, and they all cost under $2. But if you do run these, you might want to consider running fewer dual lands and in favor of more basic lands to make sure you're always able to have something as you keep reusing these ones. And if you didn't have any fetch lands whatsoever and you want to put some money into this, I'd consider just getting the Arid Mesa, and then really just maybe a couple dual lands, and we'll talk about those later. For utility lands, I've got guys like Legion Leadership, Kozul's Fury, Razor Grass Ambush, and Sejiri Shelter, which are Sunforgerable targets, but also can act as a land if you need it. For some general utility, I've got Pinnacle Monk, Mistveiled Plains, and Axeguard Armory. They can all either get things back or tutor for Sunforger. And then Emergent Zone lets you cast stuff as if it had Flash until end of turn. So you can cast Sunforger with Flash, or you can cast any of the things that Quintorius is animated with Flash as well. For the dual lands, I just wanted to highlight the duels that are worth more than $3, since you can get most Boros duels pretty cheap. Sacred Foundry and Elegant Parlor are the most expensive, but those are probably the ones I prioritize spending money on if you don't want to proxy anything, since their typing allows them to be found with fetch lands and cards like Tithe. Lotus Field is more of a meme, where if you combine it with something like Brought Back or Cosmic Intervention, you can essentially offset the weakness of needing to sacrifice 2 lands. But it is incredibly risky, since you can be stopped by a simple counterspell trying to bring the lands back. You can cut this land if you're more risk averse, but in my opinion, if this draws out someone's counterspell, that's just one less counterspell for your actually threatening cards later down the line. And then Edge of Eternity just brought Radiant Summit and Glittering Massif as new type duels that Boros can play with as well, and since they're relatively new, they should be pretty budget friendly. For some budget alternatives though, you could still use these lands. A lot of these are tapped, but they do happen to have both your colors and they cost pennies each. Alpine Meadow and Sacred Peaks were type duels that were the best options after the Sacred Foundry and Elegant Parlor, but now thanks to Edge of Eternities, there's some new budget alternatives there as well. Rustveil Bridge is an indestructible artifact, so it can make things like Roadside Reliquary work more often, or it can also be cheated back into play with guys like Goblin Engineer. Abraded Bluffs and Temple of Triumph and Woodscarred Crags all can do something when they enter. And Lorehold Camp is more of a flavor win, but it can also be used to scry one if you have excess mana in the later turns. For mana rocks, we run stuff like Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, the Boros Signet, and Talisman of course, but we also got guys like Forging the Tyrite Sword, Smothering Tithe, Jessica's Will, and then I also want to highlight cards like Brought Back or Cosmic Intervention as good ramp packages too. This deck is pretty heavy on game changers, so if you ever wanted to cut some of those out, here's some alternatives. Enlightened Tutor can be swapped out for Steel Shaper's Gift, losing the ability to grab enchantments or artifacts generically, but still getting you Sunforger and Cauldron Complete. Smuggler Shirt doesn't quite ramp you as well as Smothering Tithe does, but it does have the ability to draw cards, which is nice. A lot of the time in this deck, Jessica's Will is just making 5 to 7 mana, and then sometimes casting us Mana Rock or something off the free spells it exiles, but really you could just cut out the middleman and run a Seething Song instead for the same mana ramp. Fervent Mastery isn't quite as good as Gamble, but it does have some cool utility as well. Since it says you have to tutor up to 3 cards, you can instead just choose to grab 1 card and then discard 2 other cards out of your hand that you don't want. Or you could use it as a political tool where you could offer someone else to discard a certain number of cards and then draw more cards if you pay the reduced cost. The biggest issue with a toolbox deck like this is that you can't run everything, so let's cover some options for other ways that you can either change the Sunforger package a bit or other ways you could build the deck. Final Showdown is essentially a white version of Cyclonic Rift, but you gotta have the extra mana to be able to pay for all the spree costs if you tutor with Sunforger. Comeuppance is an alternative combat trick for Deflecting Palm, but I've always had issues with it kinda getting stuck in my hand because it costs 4 mana to cast, as opposed to Deflecting Palm only costing 2. The Planeswalker Quintorius, Wild Magic Sorcerer, and Nevalshi are great options for leaning into its casting from exile shenanigans. If you want to go down a more spirit generation game plan, the original Field Historian Quintorius offers a way to double up on token generation while you power up your spirits. If you find yourself with a lot of extra spells exiled with Quint and manage to cast them, Prop Room, Drum Bellower, and Sting, and White Plume Adventurer offer you the ability to untap Quint each turn. Leon and Shikari allows you to re-equip Sunforger at instant speed. And Invoke Calamity lets you catch people off guard when you don't have Quint out by letting you cast up to 2 spells you already cast with Sunforger again. The only reason I don't run it right now is that I don't have the ability to tutor Sunforger, but it does work great in every deck I've ever run it in. For my final thoughts, I think this deck falls into the lower end of what a Bracket 4 deck really is. It's got a lot of game changers, it's got a ton of tutoring effects, and with the right setup, it can even chain infinite turns. But it is severely limited by the fact that it's still trying to set up a Boros value engine at the beginning, and that takes some time to amass value, so any sort of aggressive deck is going to just completely outpace you while you're relying on Sunforger to try and answer them. You could easily speed this deck up with some extra fast mana like Ancient Tomb or Mana Vault, but at that point, you'd probably be better off ditching the large spell reanimation stuff and just sticking to taking infinite turns with Chance for Glory. Overall, I'm very happy with how this deck has turned out, and I think it best highlights how Boros can deliver on a control game plan that also offers some cool setups where you can drop a Parhelion 2 into play early and start beating face. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. I have more topics for decks I can do in the future, so stay tuned. They won't be anywhere near as long as this one since they aren't nearly as complex, but I've got my General Ferris Golem deck, my Felon of the Third Path Red Midrange deck, and my Zara Renegade Recruiter Theft deck. So if those sound interesting to you, don't forget to subscribe so that way you can see when they show up later. Thanks again, and I hope you have a great day.